You reach a certain income level, you feel the relief, the excitement, the sense that finally things are shifting, and then somehow, almost predictably, you find yourself back at the same number. Not because anything dramatic happened, just a slow, quiet drift back to the familiar. If you have lived this more than once, and I mean genuinely more than once, across different jobs, different strategies, different years of your life, I need you to hear something that completely changed how I understood my own financial story. This is not bad luck. It is not a lack of effort. It has almost nothing to do with strategy at all. Dr. Joe Dispenza, in his book Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, explains something that reframed everything for me. He describes your personality as the sum of how you think, how you act, and how you feel, repeated so consistently that it becomes automatic, became who you understand yourself to be. And here is the part that stopped me completely. That personality creates your personal reality. Not your strategy, not your effort level. Your personality, the repeated pattern of thought, behavior, and emotion that you run on autopilot day after day. Which means if your personality does not genuinely change, your financial reality cannot genuinely change either. You can switch jobs, switch strategies, switch industries entirely, and if the same thinking, the same behaviors, and the same emotional patterns are still running underneath all of it, you will keep producing a version of the same result, dressed up differently each time. I lived a version of this for years inside the financial and insurance world. I would hit a certain income threshold, feel a genuine sense of progress, and then, through a series of decisions that each felt reasonable in the moment, drift right back to where I had started. New strategy, new client base, new approach to selling, new year entirely. Same number eventually every single time. For a long time, I thought the answer was simply trying harder or finding a smarter approach. And I want to be clear, strategy is not irrelevant. But no strategy, however well designed, can permanently override a personality that has been repeating the same internal pattern for years. The strategy changes the surface. The personality determines what actually gets built underneath it. This is the piece that Dispenza's work made undeniable to me, and the piece I wish someone had explained to me years earlier, instead of just telling me to work harder or think more positively. By the end of this video, I am going to walk you through the specific shift that finally allowed me to interrupt a financial pattern that had repeated itself in different forms for the better part of a decade. Not a strategy, not a mindset trick, an actual interruption of the personality producing the pattern in the first place. This is the first video in a series I am doing on this book, because I think it offers one of the clearest, most practically useful frameworks I have ever encountered for understanding why certain financial patterns repeat no matter what you consciously try to change. Today, we are going to look specifically at what personality actually means in Dispenza's framework and why understanding this is the real starting point before any technique, before any strategy, before anything else. Because here is something I have come to believe completely. Most people trying to create a different financial life are not actually trying to change their personality. They are trying to change their results while leaving the personality that produced those results almost entirely untouched. And that approach, however hard you work at it, tends to produce exactly what it has always produced. If you are new here, hit subscribe and grab the free PDF on angel numbers linked in the description. Now let's get into exactly what this personality is made of, because once you see the three components clearly, you will recognize this pattern everywhere in your own financial life. So let's break down exactly what Dispenza means by personality, because once you see these three components clearly, you will start recognizing this pattern everywhere, in your own financial decisions, in the people around you, and in patterns you may have written off as simple bad luck for years. Your personality in this framework is made of three things repeating together: how you act and how you feel, not occasionally, consistently, day after day, year after year, often without you ever consciously examining any of it. And here is the part that makes this so powerful to understand. These three elements do not operate independently. They reinforce each other in a closed loop that, left unexamined, simply keeps producing the same outcome over and over. Let me walk through how this actually works, because it is more mechanical than most people realize. You think a certain set of thoughts about money, thoughts so familiar you barely register them as thoughts anymore. Something like, this is about as much as someone like me makes. Or financial growth always seems to come with some kind of cost. Those thoughts are not neutral. They generate a behavior. You hesitate before raising your rates. You undercharge a client out of a vague discomfort you cannot quite name. You avoid a conversation that could have led to a bigger opportunity because some part of you flinches at the visibility that comes with it. And that behavior produces a feeling, usually some version of the same familiar discomfort, relief, or anxiety you have felt in similar moments before. And that feeling, in turn, reinforces the original thought. The cycle completes itself and starts again, identical to the last time and the time before that. This loop is precisely why so many people can want something genuinely different, more income, more freedom, more financial breathing room, and still keep producing close to the same result. Not because they are not trying, because the thinking, acting, and feeling triangle that generates their financial behavior has never actually been interrupted. It has only been decorated with new strategies on top of the same underlying loop. I saw this so clearly in my own life during my years in the corporate world. I would think a certain way about what was realistic for someone with my background. That thought shaped how I negotiated, how I positioned myself, how much I was willing to ask for. And the outcome of those behaviors produced a feeling, usually a kind of low-grade resignation, mixed with relief that at least things were stable. And that feeling fed right back into the original thought. This is realistic, this is what makes sense for someone like me. The loop closed. And the following year, I would find myself in some version of the same financial position, having tried, genuinely, to do things differently. What I did not understand at the time is that I was changing surface-level variables while the actual loop, the thinking, acting, feeling pattern running underneath everything, remained completely untouched. And here is something Dispenza explains that I think is the most important piece of this entire conversation, and the part that explains why this loop is so much harder to break than people assume. This pattern is not just happening in your mind. It is happening in your body. Your body has been conditioned, through years of repetition, to actually anticipate and physiologically generate the emotional state associated with this loop before you consciously decide anything at all. This means that by the time you consciously try to think a new thought about money, by the time you sit down and decide today I am going to ask for what I am worth, your body may already be running the old emotional program, the familiar physiological response that has accompanied this exact situation hundreds of times before. And that physiological response, more often than conscious intention, tends to win. This is why willpower alone so rarely creates lasting financial change. You are not just fighting a thought. You are fighting a body that has been trained through repetition to predict and produce a very specific feeling in situations like this one. And that prediction shapes your behavior before your conscious mind even finishes forming the new intention. I want you to really sit with that for a moment because it reframes something most people get completely wrong about why change feels so hard. It is not that you lack discipline. It is that your body has become extraordinarily good at reproducing a familiar emotional state, and that state pulls your behavior back toward the familiar result with a kind of gravitational consistency. So if the body itself is part of what is holding this loop in place, what does it actually look like to interrupt it? That is exactly where we are headed in the next part of this conversation. Because once you understand what your body has actually been conditioned to do, the entire process of creating real, lasting financial change starts to make a different kind of sense. So we have established that your body is not a passive observer in this loop. It is an active participant, conditioned, through years of repetition, to physiologically anticipate the familiar emotional state associated with your financial patterns before your conscious mind even has a chance to decide anything different. Now I want to go deeper into exactly what this means, because Dispenza describes something here that I think is one of the most important and most overlooked pieces of why financial change feels so much harder than it should. Your body, through years of repeating the same thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, essentially learns to live as if it is already in the future emotional state associated with your typical financial outcome, before that outcome has even happened. In other words, your nervous system has become so efficient at predicting what comes next based on past patterns that it starts generating the emotional response in advance, almost as a kind of physiological rehearsal. Think about what this means practically. If, for years, financial growth has been followed in your personal history by some form of increased anxiety, exposure, or eventual setback, your body does not wait around to see if this particular opportunity will be different. It has learned the pattern. So the moment something resembling growth shows up, your body begins generating the anxious, contracted feeling associated with the eventual setback, even though nothing has actually gone wrong yet. This is why people can sabotage a genuinely good opportunity without consciously choosing to. The body is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what years of repetition trained it to do, predicting the familiar outcome and generating the familiar feeling in advance, which then shapes behavior in a way that, ironically, tends to help produce that very outcome. I want to share an example from a client I worked with because I think it illustrates this mechanism with real clarity. She had built a service-based business with genuine skill and a strong client base, but every single time her monthly revenue approached a particular threshold, a number that, when we looked closely, corresponded almost exactly to an income level from a difficult period earlier in her life, something would happen. A client would unexpectedly cancel. She would suddenly feel overwhelmed and turn down new work. A pricing decision she had been confident about the week before would suddenly feel impossible to follow through on. When we traced this back, it became clear that her body had learned, years earlier, to associate that particular income range with a specific kind of stress and instability. Not consciously. Not as a thought she could easily articulate. But physiologically, her nervous system had filed that number under danger, and every time her actual income approached it, her body began generating the anticipatory stress response before anything had even gone wrong in the present moment. She was not failing at strategy. Her strategy was sound. Her body was simply doing what conditioned bodies do, rehearsing a familiar emotional future in advance, and shaping her behavior accordingly. This is the piece that made everything click for me when I first encountered it, because it explained something I had felt but never been able to articulate clearly in my own financial journey. That strange, almost physical resistance that would show up right as things started to genuinely shift. It was not random. It was not weakness. It was a body that had become extraordinarily skilled at predicting an emotional future based on a well-worn past, and reacting to that prediction as though it were already happening. And here's why this matters so much for anyone trying to create real financial change. If the body is generating the emotional state of the old pattern before the new opportunity has even had a chance to unfold, then thinking new thoughts alone, however genuine, will keep running into a physiological response that has nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with a well-rehearsed past. So the real question becomes, how do you actually interrupt a physiological prediction that has been rehearsed for years, rather than just trying to think your way past it? That is exactly where I want to take you next, into the specific shift I personally used to begin breaking this exact pattern in my own financial life. Not a mindset technique layered on top of the old loop, but something that actually addressed the body's role in the entire process. So here is where I want to bring everything together and share the specific shift that finally allowed me to interrupt a financial pattern that had repeated itself in different forms for years. Once I understood that my body was rehearsing an emotional future based on a well-worn past, generating the anxious, contracted feeling associated with financial growth before anything had actually gone wrong, I realized that thinking new thoughts alone was never going to be enough. I needed to interrupt the loop at the level where it was actually being generated. Thought, action, and feeling all reinforcing each other, all rooted in a body that already knew how this story was supposed to end. The first real shift came from something deceptively simple. I started catching the physiological response itself, in the moment, rather than only catching the thought. This meant paying attention to the actual physical sensation that showed up right as something genuinely new was about to happen. A tightness, a subtle bracing, a familiar contraction in the chest or stomach right before a significant financial conversation or decision. Instead of moving forward despite that sensation, or trying to think my way past it with a quick affirmation, I started doing something different. I would pause. I would notice the sensation clearly, without immediately reacting to it or trying to suppress it. And then, deliberately, I would breathe into it and consciously generate a different physiological state, not by pretending the old feeling was not there, but by intentionally creating, in my body, the felt sense of the calm, grounded, already arrived version of myself that this new financial chapter actually called for. This is closer to what Dispenza describes as closing the gap between thinking and being. It is not affirming a thought while the body still runs the old emotional program underneath it. It is deliberately generating a new emotional and physiological state, repeatedly, until the body itself starts to learn a different pattern to predict. I remember the first time I did this deliberately, before a financial conversation that, in the past, would have triggered the familiar contraction and the familiar self-sabotage that followed it. I noticed the old sensation rising, and instead of letting it run the show, I took a few minutes beforehand to consciously breathe, to physically soften my shoulders, to generate as genuinely as I could the felt sense of someone who had already had this conversation successfully many times before. Not faking confidence. generating, in my actual body, the emotional signature of the outcome I wanted, ahead of the event itself. The conversation that followed unfolded differently than the pattern would have predicted. Not dramatically, but differently enough that I noticed it clearly. And here is what I think matters most about this practice. It is not a one-time fix. Just like the old pattern was built through years of repetition, the new pattern requires consistent repetition too. Every single time I caught the old physiological prediction rising and consciously chose to generate something different instead, even imperfectly, even for just a few minutes, I was teaching my body a new pattern to anticipate. Over time, those repeated interruptions started to add up into something that felt, by comparison, genuinely different. Less reactive. Less governed by an old emotional rehearsal that had nothing to do with my actual present circumstances. This is the real starting point for breaking a personality that has been quietly producing the same financial reality for years. Not new information. Not a better strategy layered on top of an unchanged internal pattern. The willingness to catch the body in the act of predicting an old future and to deliberately, repeatedly, offer it something different to learn instead. In the next video of this series, we are going to go even deeper into exactly how the body holds onto the past and a specific practice for working with that directly, beyond what we covered here today. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a great time, because that conversation builds directly on everything we explored together in this one. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this video. It truly means the world to me, and I hope this conversation brought you something real, something you can carry with you starting today. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. We have so much more to explore together. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. You never know whose life you might change with a single video. The books that have shaped my journey and that I personally recommend are all linked in the description below. Go check them out. They are worth every page. And don't forget, there is a free PDF in the description on how to interpret angel numbers and equal hours. Grab yours. It is completely free, and it might just change the way you see the signs the universe has been sending you all along. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.